One of the things that seems to factor into your scenario of buying shoes, basically because you got us into this because of that. It's all your fault. We could also talk about earrings, I suppose. One of the things that happens is we realize that these objects are signifiers that allow for certain kinds of mobility, or that will limit us and shut down social possibilities for ourselves.
But so, carrying on with Bobby's example, the giving someone an ear, you know, has cultural implications. There may be some cultures where it's acceptable, some where it's not, you know.
Having another ear on your arm, or growing
a
spare.
Growing a spare, is it acceptable? Is it shocking? But
was it really an ear?
I don't know. What other aspect? Is there an art aspect to that? Or?
An art aspect to what?
So giving someone an ear. I mean, I'm trying to put it in your kind of framework here.
Oh, sure. What is an ear on one's arm? It's not unlike what a surrealist painter would do.
No, I'm saying the Van Gogh example of giving someone the ear. How would that differ from the painting, which is
well, one of the things that we often will talk about in poetry is the poet's use of metonymy. Okay, so or synecdoche. Those are figures of speech. So if I cut off my ear and give it to you as a gift, right? I'm taking a part of what I am, right? And I'm letting it stand for all of me, right? So that's a figure of speech. It's called synecdoche, right? Where a part stands for the whole. Well, imagine that you're a king and you have a crown, right? And if you give your crown to someone as a gift or as a present, that's called metonymy, because the crown, it's not a part of the king's body, but it's associated with the king, okay, or with the queen. So if the king or the queen gives you his or her crown, that's giving you a symbol or a sign or a signifier that stands for you in your absence as a token of memory, status, or whatever it might be. Does that make so those kinds of objects are functioning poetically as figures. Okay. Now, one of the things that we say about figures when we're thinking about poetic theory is that a figure is something that opens up the world. So with that ear or that crown or whatever gift you happen to give that's part of you or associated with you, in that object comes as a world that surrounds you, and that world is there in that signifier insofar as it's remembered and so on. Is that working for you? So what we need, if we want to advance this discussion, is a more developed theory of what we mean by a figure in a work of art. Heidegger says the figure is constituted in the strife between earth and world. Now, that doesn't make much sense if you haven't read all that stuff. But what he seems to be implying is that in any figure, the crown, the ear, the shoe, whatever it might be, the avatar, in that figure, there's something that is available and provides access. There's an opening, and we're claimed by it, we pay attention to it. But that in that very figure, there's something that withdraws as well. So there's a withdrawing, and the thing that withdraws in the figure pulls us in. So the figures are made up of this tension between something that opens up and something that withdraws. And that's operating in any kind of figure that we find in any form of art. So, now what this tells us is that a theory of poetry can advance our thinking about technology. Because what if the thing I give you is not an ear or a crown, but a laptop, right? Or a flash drive, right? Is that making some sense? Or so these this is why I was hammering away on the idea a couple weeks ago that we tend to think that things are not us. So we tend to think that there is a world of things over here, right? They're just objects. And somehow my lived human world is over here, right? And somehow I establish, because I'm an identity, right? A single unity and all that. That's false. That's not what I am. But we imagine ourselves into thinking that there's living stuff over here and there's dead stuff over here. Right? But what I was trying to point out is that the stuff that we consider to be non-human dead stuff, just like objects, paper clips and so on, crowns, shoes, whatever our example might be, that these things are actually not simply non-human dead objects. right? That they only have an existence because they're an objectification of some more fundamental living processes.
And what Scarlett's saying is almost the opposite.
I think he is, yeah. I think Stark is.
So there's this kind of looping thing.
Yeah, I think if I understand him, he's starting in a different place. Okay, and therefore he's more shocking because he starts in a place. I hate to say this, but if you follow the argument I'm making, it's not all that big of a deal that you can grow an ear on your arm. Right? And it's shocking, but if you actually start to think about it, it's not all that upsetting. Right? If you change the way you think. So, huh?
Just looks weird.
Yeah, it's very weird. I mean, you know, I've got lots of questions about the ear on the arm. But, so, there are lots of questions for me and for you.
Well,
I think I know where I was going with my example was you're talking about Facebook and get somebody like that, talking about that hard drive that came out and use your Facebook. And how it's not the hard drive. The hard drive, it's the software on it. And that software can be translated, it can be copied. And just like just talking, you can give me an idea. And I'm thinking about it in my terms where the hardware in my brain sends you the software, the idea, to put it in your brain, so that it doesn't matter what the medium is so much as just this bunch of ideas coming together that's conscious.
Right. I mean, another set of terms that we probably want to factor in based on observations that you're making, and it would be part of this larger discussion, is that as human beings, basically, if somebody was asking earlier about Dasein, one way to think about what this is that Dasein is essentially constituted by three things, so to speak, three conditions that are equiprimordial. Wherever you have one, you have the other two. These would be facticity. This is a word that nobody thinks is a word. Facticity, understanding. And this is a word that we think we know, but it means something other than what you think it is. Facticity, understanding, and discourse. So these, one way to think about what's happening in the existential analytic of the conditions that make us human is to say that for example, there's something, to think about discourse as something like language. Okay? So one of the things that we have to factor in is that while the hard drive might be the material site which these information systems become their existence, right? That insofar as something like language, whether it's code or a natural language, it doesn't matter, like a natural language that you find in a book, right? A lot of times artists think, well, gee, I've written this novel, it'll live beyond me, I've achieved immortality. This novel will continue to signify after Richard Powers is gone. And one reason why a lot of people write works of art and sculptures and so on is so that the beauty that they're capable of imagining and realizing in the world endures and persists beyond their own mortality. So the difficult answer to your observation is that this thing, discourse, right? The message that you're imagining, the thing that gets sent from you to me or me to you, right? The discourse somehow plays across this process, okay? And it has its own materiality. It has its own agency. It has its own form. It has its own ends. In a word, what these things are is this is something like language. So all human beings have something like language. But remember, language is always something other. We tend to think of language as being belonging to us, but we had to acquire language. Or you might remember that argument that I was making a couple weeks ago. So one of the things that I'd be suggesting here is that this discourse isn't in the person, right? It's acquired. The understanding is a kind of resoluteness. It's an attitude toward being decisive. Let me just put it that way for now. Facticity has to do with the fact that we just find ourselves always already in the world. Okay? So we just, I didn't choose to be born in Joliet, Illinois. Right? That's what happened, though. Right? I didn't choose to the parents that I was born to, but that's what happened. And once I was at only once. I was at the wake when my father died. I was a first-year grad student, and I had one of these incredible existential moments. A woman came up to me, and I looked a lot like my father, and I did more so even then than years ago. And she came up to me and she said, "You must be John because you look just like your father. when he was young. And I said, I'm sorry, no, my name's Patrick, my brother John is over there. And my father's name was John. And I said, so I thought she was looking for my older brother. And she said, no, you look just like your father did when he was young. And I said, pardon me, I don't know who you are. And she said to me, I dated your father when we were in high school. And I just had this complete sort of sinking feeling, like, oh my God, if she'd been successful, I wouldn't exist. I wouldn't exist. So facticity is trying to get to that particular way in which hypercults were thrown into the world. Okay? So we often want to imagine that we're sort of the originators of our own being, that we create ourselves sui generis or something, causa sui or something.
You know, I'm going to think of that word every time I watch Back to the Future now.
Which one?
Facticity. Because that's the whole premise, is about not existing.
Yeah, that's true. It's thrownness. The way we're just thrown into the world. And we find ourselves in the world before we really know much about it. So what I'm trying to do this semester while I'm working with you is I'm trying to come up with an adequate and an accurate, a sufficient theory that will be complex enough to account for the kinds of arguments that we have, that where we keep circling back around and saying some of the same things, so that we're not traumatized by the discussion, but we can actually make some fairly rigorous intellectual progress in pursuing the questions. Is that making some sense? But I think that these are the kinds of things in some way that we need to structure and organize and clarify as we go. We'll probably be adding to the list.
Every time you do this, Patrick, I think that I've been having really amateur conversations about this with people all my life. You know, we've not been doing it properly.
Well, you do the tech side of it,
yeah.
Right? And I don't have a clue what that is. But so what we haven't yet done in our own intellectual history and in terms of what's available to us is that this is where our culture is. Right? So I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk in these kind of casual and precise ways. I think we want to heighten the way we do that, but at the same time, while we're doing that, we want to see if we can bring in some what we call this is theorizing or systematizing. We want to systematize the problem. I think this is the way to do it, involving elements like these. Okay.
Right.
But you know, it's 5:07 and
well, the last 15 minutes.
Okay, I just wanted to have a reality check. Because now I've just been talking.
That's okay. That's okay. What I'd just like to do is, I'd like each of the groups to just give a quick. Should we get a quick report from each group, or just tell us that you've met and perhaps that you've started to talk about something? I mean, I don't expect you to have things set up, but just even some feelings about your group and you know, anything. If you haven't met yet, say you haven't met yet. That's okay. But you know, just give. Is that okay? Shall we? I'll pull up. I got. Hey. Can you? Sorry, Patrick. What did you say?
Can we just go in numerical order?
Yeah, I'll pull them up now, and then we can do that. So we have the imaginatively named Group 1 at the back there. You are welcome to give yourself another name if you want, at any time.
Actually, the fact that we're Group 1 comes in perfectly to the topic we're going to go with. In fact, Joe realized the irony when we picked it out. We're covering the idea of the singularity.
Oh, good. Well, we've talked about that today. Does everyone know what the singularity is? Anyone know?
Isn't that the thing that Kurzweil talks about?
Yeah, exactly. Anyone not know what it is?
Can I ask Group 1 what they think it is?
Yeah?
We just started.
We just started.
So what's your hunch?
Well, once we picked up the question, I was reading a little bit here on the singularity, and just this idea, and I'm terrible with the way I'm putting the words, but the people, technology, and everything, so integrated that essentially, I would say, I can really only explain this as an analogy. But I'll go back to the idea of right now, anything, any computer, any software, whatever, you can get fairly instantaneous updates. Well, I remember a bunch of years ago, before Windows updates, you used to have to send in money to Microsoft to get some of the updates. You had a disk, it took weeks, it took months. Now this is the idea that we just hit a button, all our software is more or less upgraded. Well, imagine doing that on the level of an entire society, a planet, universe. I mean, it's kind of crazy in both directions, but imagine a new genetic abnormality was suddenly introduced in the human race. Imagine the ability for somebody to hit the button, upgrades all the genetic, I mean, that goes to the really science fiction points of it, but just that idea of this all merged together, so it's as simple as changing. And then you've got changes on the hour. I mean, imagine the entire world changing in about the time that you would change your desktop on your computer, for the good or the bad here. I guess Brian mentioned, you know, the kind of scariness of that.
Yeah, if we all have access to information, like, we're all now on this sort of equal ground. The only thing that's going to stop our advances is our ambition or our maliciousness, because we're all sort of on new equal footing. Everything's changed. That's never happened. And it sort of, you know, it brings up a lot of questions. Like, you know, what is the purpose of property now? What constitutes an individual now that we're all sort of on this equal footing? What makes us different anymore? What would constitute government in this sort of society? How are we going to, you know, contemplate time anymore, if time is even of an issue anymore? Will we start measuring things in terms of resource consumption, things like that?
Well, my comment on that is it's a very interesting, this kind of super intelligence technology advancing so fast we can't even see it advancing anymore. I would advise you, I don't know if you have any comments on this, but I'd advise you to focus in a little bit on one of those questions. Trying to answer all those questions you just raised is going to take you a lifetime.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah.
focusing on one particular aspect or one particular question. You know?
Yeah, and I think that it's a time, let things expand, but do it in such a way where you know you're going to have to.
Well, that's why we started with a broad question, and we were going to work, kind of work it from the out the end, get a more specific question at the end. This is the, you know, what is a singularity, one of the issues, and then splitting it down from there.
Right.
With,
Damien's advice is really advice that will keep you sane, bring it down to something manageable.
Yes.
As soon as you can.
and try with this project not to give us just factual information. You know, we're not after you telling us about a technology or a particular thing. We're after you investigating the question.
Right.
Critical inquiry, or inquiry, as the Americans say.
So you don't want us to just regurgitate Kurzweil's definition of singularity. You want us to speculate on what we think it would be?
Yeah, well, question his definition by all means. You know, you interpret it. Definitely question the Wikipedia definition. You know, but you know, investigate it.
Should we move on?
Yes, absolutely. Group number 2, Brandon. Let's do 2. Oh, there we are. Who wants to say something? Have you met?
Last class.
That's okay.
We want to question, just looking at the sheet that we got for the assignment, we noticed that one of the examples was the Patricia McCordick, the machines who think, and we thought it was interesting that the word who was used. So we want to kind of look into maybe why, even though, you know, looking at a machine, why is it being anthropomorphized like that? We've thought of a few theories of that we can look into, like the Casa theory and what was it? There was another theory you got.
I was going to try and explain it through evolutionary psychology terms, like the
What a surprise.
hyperactive agent
That's good.
device and things like that. So.
Look, there's a lot in the history of computing about genderization of technology, which is how people feel about technology has a gender. You know, I think I've talked to you about this before.
Yeah, I kind of wrote my paper about it last semester.
Yeah. Yeah, so you may want to think about that. Any comments, Patrick?
Not really. But if you're going in that direction, Donna Haraway's work might interest you, the Cyborg Manifesto, and the point about evolutionary psych and evolutionary biology might factor in Donna Haraway's work.
I should just put a few, there are a few readings like Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales.
We need to.
I should just put these on here.
Should put Technopoly up too.
Technopoly.
For them.
Yeah, Technopoly.
The essay that I uploaded called Trans-Humanism by Hook or Cook, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Is it Hook? Yeah. That has a pretty good preliminary bibliography. But there are others. There are lots of them online. The Trans-Humanism website, the FAQs for Trans-Humanism, they also have a lot of bibliographic citations.
Yeah, so have a look at those. Okay, thank you. Group 3. Max and Anthony, have you met yet?
Just kind of.
There was some separately online.
Yeah, you've talked online. Any ideas or still just vague? That's it, shaking heads.
A little vague, maybe a little bit more directed than vague, but the chat that we did have, we're going to try to approach consciousness, maybe from a little bit of a pop sci standpoint.
Kind of sneak up on it from behind.
Yeah, sci-fi. There was talk about Terminators and zombies and stuff. So,
that's interesting. The zombie aspect of consciousness is a good one. I like that.
I'm interested in Robocop because the guy's name was Murphy.
He teaches at SU.
Did you have a look at the FAQs and specific questions on consciousness, or the transhumanism as specific? Don't try and say, oh, we're going to tackle consciousness, because you won't. Do something quite specific.
It's better to think about consciousness as from what we call a genealogical perspective. It's better to think of it as a concept that develops over time and that serves certain purposes at a particular time and in a particular place, rather than thinking that there might be some persisting sort of attribute to consciousness.
well, certainly, and especially if we're going to use media perspectives.
Yeah. So think about consciousness as a word that we set up at the place where our ignorance begins, to echo Nietzsche's statement. It might free you up then to say, it relieves you from that pressure of having to discover it or settle it on what it is, and it allows you to just kind of look at how it plays out in any given scenario.
So do you mean like we could use like pop culture references for like an allegory to like how we think of these things nowadays?
You certainly could. Yeah.
Like how, I'm sure like in ancient Egypt, how they had to deal with gods and things that nature, how they saw it. Use popular culture now, like this is how we gotta represent these things.
Yeah, I think that's good.
But remember to look deeply at these questions. We're asking for some critical analysis of this, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah, by all means use zombies, but think about them critically.
Right.
I never thought I'd say that.
How self-conscious can a zombie be? I don't know.
And self-conscious.
What does a zombie see when a zombie looks in the mirror?
Zombies are on my mind today, as those of you who are on my Facebook page know. And my wife bought me from Kickstarter project, a comic artist who drew me as a zombie. And that was my present. So, Katie and Bobby. And Philip as well. Have you had any discussion yet?
Yeah.
that was a depressing yes.
We started with the question, what does form have to do with consciousness, or what effect does form have on consciousness?
And what do you mean by form?
That's a good question. We talked about it for a long time. We talked about physicality, we talked about, I don't know, what else?
Abstract form.
Abstract form.
Programming models.
Yeah.
Again, I try and focus in on one of those. Again, trying to do, that's a big question again.
I was focusing more on like, what is it to be a bad idea? Like,
what is it to be a cat?
yeah, that argument, like you can never like feel like that, not bad. Like, you can speculate and stuff like that. I forget where the argument goes, but
The philosopher's concept.
yeah, well, that's what we were talking about. We were talking about the questions first came up with changing it. We just met at the bar and had an awesome conversation. It was what constraints does form apply to consciousness?
That's the kind of thing I talk about in bars all the time.
Philip, do you remember this?
To me, it's interesting because this is kind of what I was talking about that night, is that when we talk about artificial consciousness, a lot of the time we kind of think we're trying to make some kind of human-like consciousness. And I think of like William Gibson and Neuromancer and worldwide net of an artificial intelligence. It's not going to be anything like a human. If you take a consciousness, put it in a box, and that box is a wireless network expanding the globe, it's not going to think, even in the way it senses,
Brilliant.
change the way it senses, it's not
There's
going to.
a great line in William Brannigan wrote on the discussion group. It talks about the human limitations we have and the problems we have as humans, and these human limitations do not have to be imparted onto any artificial intelligence.
Wait, could you say that again?
These human limitations do not have to be imparted upon any artificial intelligence. I thought that was a nice way of putting it. I even highlighted it. You know, this idea of something I've mentioned before. I know we're running low on time.
Did we miss group 4?
Yes.
Group 4, you guys?
That was 5, so...
I think we passed 5. Group
Yes,
4.
you did miss us.
5. Did I miss group 4?
Yes.
Tom and Caleb.
I apologize.
And after all the help I do for you.
Oh, she gives me all the help. Yeah.
We were kind of thinking about the connotations of the term post-human, which is I like to think very anthropologically about it, culturally, because
Cultural
I think
examples in media.
if you maybe went back to my ancient ancestors, they would think of me as a post-human. I can't imagine that the post-human would be removed from humanity, unless, of course, they took their consciousness and put it in a box. But I believe that the more the technology is integrated with the humanity, the more that humanity is going to become technological.
Quick question for you. You said, I believe. What did the rest of your group believe?
Something similar.
We haven't talked that
Something
much.
I mean, I guess one of the things we might want to look into is Plato's argument of the Argo, right? Am I right on that? Aristotle, yeah. Plato, Greek philosophers.
Yeah.
That I had seen it actually a lot in terms of the Blackwell Philosophy and Pop Culture series has, in at least one occasion, essays on that discussion in relation to games, such as I think there's even something on, that argument in terms of respawning in multiplayer games. So like you play Halo and you die.
We got to move on for
But yeah.
Can we hear briefly from group 6 and 7?
Very briefly.
Group 6?
Well, because I just want to prep a little bit, if I can get a quick idea of what the topics are before we have to go.
Group 6?
My left
Group
6. Talking briefly last time about Christopher Cook's essay talks about transhumanism as being a way to control human evolution. So I'm interested in the term of control. How much control do humans have on technology? Is it natural? If there is a sense of control, will the creator of technology impart their own perspective or biases onto that technology? What is that?
That is classic. I like that one a lot. Yeah. And I do like the ones that are taking a turn and looking at it.
Yeah.
It's a good way to approach a problem is to take a turn and say we're going to look at this phrase.
And group 7?
Group 7.
We're looking at essentially the 3 different perspectives. What is intelligent?
From which 3 three perspectives?
Our own three perspectives and what we've done in our academic careers.
And what was the characterize the difference?
What is intelligence?
What is intelligence?
Yeah, you got to yell real loud.
Oh,
I don't hear you, but
yeah.
there's a big room behind you.
So three different perspectives that we have on what is intelligence. So mine, I think, is images. So we're going to try and delve into and use all this stuff.
Can you characterize the differences between your three perspectives?
Psychology, computer science / international studies, art.
Yeah, I still think that's a big question.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, we've been arguing since the time of Aristotle about what is intelligence, and we still haven't got it. So, you know, it's a complex question. All right. Any last comments or questions?
Unassigned group.
Oh, those of you unassigned in a group, please pick one you want to join, really, and talk to the people. Pick one, the question that interests you, and join one. Just make sure.